My name is Jay, and I'm Sydney West's father. On September 30th, 2020, my daughter, Sydney West, disappeared out of San Francisco. She was 19 years old. She grew up just 40 miles from San Francisco. But we had moved halfway through Sydney's high school in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
My name is Kimberly West. I'm Sydney West's mother. Sydney is a very intelligent person. As a child, she just had her hands in so many different things.
She was a kid that would sit for hours and just draw or construct and just create. And, that was one of the things that I cherished about her.
She would love spending time with her sister, Faith, and the dogs. Sports have always been a very big part of her life, from when she was young, playing softball, to when she started playing volleyball in middle school, and then played throughout high school, and then also played club volleyball. She also is passionate about the arts, so that would be her piano playing, songwriting, singing, putting that together.
She eventually began to write and perform music here locally. And it was incredibly well received.
She applied to lots of schools, and she actually got into a lot of schools. One of those was UC Berkeley. And we were so excited for her and so happy for her. But this was 2020, and because of COVID, things were rapidly changing. Sydney's dream was to go to Cal and have the college experience that she dreamed of. And when she got there, it was completely the opposite of that.
The whole COVID thing was awful. We showed up in Berkeley, adorning masks, and, moving her in was, you had to take turns moving in because you weren't allowed to meet people in the hallway. And that was a challenge. In all honesty, I was incredibly worried about her.
Once Sydney was in the dorms and classes were starting, none of her classes were going to be in person. They were 100% going to be remote on the computer. That was an enormous challenge to her. And, socially, the isolation, she was really suffering. Ultimately, the decision amongst us all was that she would defer and leave UC Berkeley with the hopes that by the following year, things would be, back to normal. So once Sydney left the dorms, she took advantage of the fact that we had lived in California for a long time and knew many people. So she reached out to some of her friends and visited different friends and stayed with different friends who were in the Bay Area. And then ultimately, she stayed with some close family friends in Livermore for a few weeks. And she was trying to figure out what she was going to do. This was not a part of the plan. And this is a kid who likes to plan. So whether she was going to stay there, she was going to come here, she was going to get a job, I think she was trying to figure that out. But she liked to go into the city, into San Francisco. And so on September 29th, 2020, she decided to spend the night in the city. So she got a hotel room for that night.
I know she was struggling then as well. And so she went to a hotel to, decompress. At that time, I was out in California, in San Diego for work. And that day was the last time I spoke to Sydney. I remember having that phone call. We had been on the phone for well over an hour. And, we talked about where she was and what she was doing. And I wanted her to come home. But she felt like she had let herself down, that she had let her family down. And much of my conversation was, tell me what I can do right now to help you. Because I love you. And just reminding her that she's got a whole army of people around her that loved her. And that she was not alone. And she knew that. And I believe we wrapped up her phone call around 4:30. I think everything was somewhat uncertain. I didn't really know what her plans were. Of course, I expected to speak with her the next day.
On September 30th, 2020, it was a pretty regular day. I took our daughter Faith to school, And then I was home. Sydney knew, we were very open about the fact that we all shared location. That was not abnormal, especially given that she was on the other side of the country. We weren't trying to harass her or be a pain, but she's a beautiful young woman, and we just wanted to make sure that, that we had some eyeballs on her in a way that we could.
That morning, I woke up pretty early. It was probably about 7. Maybe I'm a stalker dad, but I checked the locations. And Sydney's I couldn't find. I tried calling her, but couldn't raise her by phone. She would typically respond to a text, but the texts were going unread. I couldn't find her and I couldn't call her, and we didn't know where she was.
Jay called me, and we had a phone conversation about, what do you know? What do I know? What can we find out? We knew where she had stayed in terms of the hotel. So we reached out to make sure she had checked out, to find out what was going on there. I do remember grabbing my iPad that had access to Sydney's email and stuff like that to see if there was something going on. Our bank accounts are linked, so I remember going in there and seeing if there was anything. I knew that she had taken a ride share, so I found that receipt. And Sydney left the hotel the morning of September 30th. It was early. It was a little after 6 a.m. and that she arrived to the Crissy Field Golden Gate Bridge area around 6:30 a.m. And that wasn't that unusual. She could have been going there to exercise. She loved the Golden Gate Bridge. She liked to spend time there.
My brother Rob lives just south of San Francisco. So I called Rob. I told him I was coming.
I was at work, and he basically called me to tell me that, all of her communications, the phone was off, and he could not locate her. And he was coming up to San Francisco that afternoon. It was stressful and very scary, not knowing where she was, and so I met him in San Francisco.
My brother and I went pretty much straight away to Crissy Field, which is near the Golden Gate Bridge, and started looking for her.
I know it's kind of crazy, but you had to look. Just had to do whatever you could do in that moment.
And, we're literally 2 guys in a city of 5 million walking around trying to find, this young woman. We were going to people and saying, have you seen this girl? Showing them pictures. And they're like, do you have a flyer? And we're like, no. We felt entirely inadequate, to be honest. We're thinking, where the hell could she be? Her bank account didn't have a ton of money in it, and she hadn't shown up back in Livermore, so we're freaking dead worried. It was at this point that we called the SFPD.
We met the police somewhere in San Francisco, somewhere downtown, and we were giving a report to them and filing a missing persons report.
I was feeling terror, and it was clear to me that those alarm bells that she's not safe had gone off in my head.
At that moment, I just felt kind of helpless and out of sorts. And then I just remember my stomach just kind of sinking and just feeling like that throughout the day. And it felt very, very surreal.
I was there in San Francisco for at least a day. And then I flew home to Chapel Hill. My wife was crushed, and her little sister didn't really understand what was going on. My responsibility as a husband and father was to be there for my family. And it was a very difficult decision to come home because I felt like I was leaving Sydney out there. But we felt like it was better to take a step back and define a strategy of how we're going to find her, because 4 legs in San Francisco aren't going to do it. That was clear.
I am Roxy Garrity. I've been covering the Sydney West case. So Sydney's case is unique. Sydney was last seen in Crissy Field. This area actually has its own police force, the Golden Gate Bridge Patrol. So authorities had to communicate with each other. Crissy Field is federal land. The San Francisco police had to work with those federal agents.
At that point, we were in Chapel Hill, but we were assigned a detective that began to investigate the case in San Francisco. It wasn't long after that detective contacted me. I'll never forget where I was when that happened. I was about halfway down Route 86 in Hillsborough, and I damn near crashed the truck into the woods. Sydney's backpack was found near the bridge. I have still not been able to look in that backpack. this point, Sydney had been missing for about a week, and from the police department in San Francisco, the SFPD, had gone to the bridge and seen video of Sydney on the bridge.
They told us that they had found video on the Golden Gate Bridge of someone who looked like Sydney. And they were basically telling us, sorry, she was last seen on the bridge, so that's probably not good news.
They believed that she had committed suicide. I was shattered. Shattered. So I started asking a lot of questions. How do you know this? What evidence do you have?
It just left me with like a million questions about what they saw.
It is difficult for me to conceive of her doing that because of her personality. She's not the kind of kid who just throws her relationships away. She never has been. But Sydney struggled with anxiety and depression, and she had been struggling with it for a couple of years. In July 2020, we were on a family vacation up on the lake near Asheville, North Carolina. And we had our boat up there, and our boat was under a dock that had a roof, and you could jump off the roof and into the water. And it was a pretty good drop. It was probably 15, 16 feet to the water. And so she asked me, hey, Dad, what do you think about me jumping off with a floaty? I said, don't do it, because you're going to hit the water and you're going to stop. And it's going to be like hitting the concrete. And I think she thought I was kidding. And she jumped off.
I remember when she came up from the water, her lip was bleeding as if she had taken a blow to the head, which she did. So she felt nauseous. She was not feeling well.
She was severely concussed. Now, part of this I feel responsible for. She always wanted to kind of impress me or be like me. I don't even think my wife knows that I feel bad about that.
After that trip, when we got home, it was quite evident that she was not feeling well, and she was diagnosed with a concussion. It seemed like things kept happening. The concussion, not feeling well, not being able to really be with friends. It just kind of seemed like the punches kept coming. So I felt sad for her and felt bad. And I also knew that this wasn't a great thing for anybody's mental health. It was gonna just make her feel further depressed and sad.
Her mood swings, everything changed when that occurred. Her personality was different after that. Typically, people that are concussed that have any kind of history of anxiety and depression, it's a massive trigger to bring those symptoms back on. And I think that we saw that.
We hadn't seen the video at that point. We just had talked to the detective who made an immediate conclusion. She had jumped off the bridge.
I remember asking if we could see the bridge footage, and we were definitely told no, that was not possible, that they don't share that.
This wasn't a smooth process where there was engagement and cooperativity. We literally had to scream bloody murder at the police commissioner through a very senior level attorney general to get them to move. And we're blessed with some people that we know that can move the needle. And we were granted access, my brother and I, to watch the video on the bridge. And so I flew back to California for that and to collect Sydney's belongings from the police department. Hands down, that was the worst day of my life. Hands down, the worst day of my life.
It's understandable why the San Francisco police may think that Sydney West committed suicide. She was a young girl struggling, last seen on the Golden Gate Bridge. And since it was built in 1937, it's been a magnet for suicides, and thousands of people have jumped off that bridge.
My brother and I were with the bridge police for about 2 hours, maybe more. To be honest, I was thinking that I was going to watch my daughter plunge to her death. And what we saw in the video was Sydney. It was her. She ran up on the south span of the bridge closest to the city. She was initially walking, and she had her phone in her hand because you could see that it was lit. And then she turned around and she went back down and then reemerged without her backpack and began running up the bridge. It was about 6:36 a.m. I could even see her idiosyncratic kind of behavior, her dad-pleasing behavior as she was running. Because one of the things I used to teach her was, to run in a certain way so she didn't damage her knees. And she was running like that. And then there's another bridge cam that's further up the bridge that we saw Sydney again run past that camera. And I think it's very important to understand that those cameras are not there to image people. They're there for essentially the security of the bridge. And so it was dark, it was quite foggy at the time that she was there. And there's essentially 3 visuals of her. She walked up, walked back, dumped the bag, went for a run. And what we looked for most was her exiting the bridge. Could we see a figure like her exiting the bridge on either side? And we could not.
There were so many people on the bridge that morning. It was shocking, actually, surprising how many people. There was a lot of people coming and going, people on bikes, people running.
The detective, her reasoning for thinking that it was suicide was that Sydney had left her backpack in the park and that she hasn't exited the bridge. That's it.
The bridge police made an immediate conclusion and did not seem to be any inclination to ask any more questions past that.
But there's no possible way, in my mind, that there's any way she could have gotten over that rail without somebody seeing something. I watched the video, it was busy, and they would see somebody climbing over the rail. My brother and I left to go downtown San Francisco to go to the police department to pick up Sydney's backpack.
I actually took her backpack because he couldn't touch it. There wasn't anything to help with that. She had a bunch of artwork, drawings, and things like that. A couple of items of clothing, I think. That was about it.
Mainly it was overnight clothes, probably because she had decided to spend the night in the city and got a hotel room for that night. But also there were some notebooks and some colored pencils, nothing of true significance in terms of giving us more information that she had jumped. I just found my brain wanting so much more information than what I could get from them. And it was just super frustrating.
The San Francisco Police Department, they believed that she had committed suicide. So effectively what they were saying is the case is open, but we're not going to investigate any further. There is not a shred of evidence that she went over the rail of that bridge.
We were on our own. It was clear at that point that it was our responsibility, that the law enforcement had moved on. And I mean, I was literally calling morgues for a long time. Like on a daily basis. Looking for my niece. It was hard to do that. And I was literally just going out on a kayak and looking for her. Just to, look and try to find some proof.
We don't have any remains, nothing. And so, we can't end there.
It was very apparent that we needed to do anything we could to find Sydney. We were researching what organizations are out there that can help us, what avenues we should use to put information out. We put together a flyer. We talked to 2 different private investigators and ultimately hired ours, Scott Dudek.
My name is Scott Dudek. I'm a private investigator in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was contacted by the West family approximately 2 weeks after Sydney disappeared, and they reached out to me to see if I could assist them in finding their missing daughter. I have approximately 32 years of experience in law enforcement. One of my specialties as a private investigator is, in fact, trying to locate people that have disappeared. I think originally the San Francisco police took on the missing person case, but then I think what ended up happening is, A, they're a very busy department. B, I think they started to think something may have happened to Sid by Sid's choice. And I think once they made up that decision, they never really looked any further. One of the first steps I take in an investigation like this is try to get into their background. Sydney's father let me know that the last time he spoke to her was on September 29th, and that was via phone. She arrived at the hotel in San Francisco in the afternoon. She checked out on September 30th and ordered an Uber around 6:25 a.m. When the Uber picked her up, the Uber driver took her to Crissy Field in San Francisco, and the video showed Sid walking on the Golden Gate Bridge. I'm not sure if she was planning on going to that area, but I did learn it's something that she enjoyed doing. It was very foggy that day, extremely foggy that day. It was kind of just a very eerie thing. She just kind of disappears in the fog, never to be seen again. As a private investigator, one of the first things I want to do is I want to feel comfortable ruling out certain things. And one of the biggest things that I wanted to rule out was that she committed suicide. So I decided to talk to her doorman at the hotel she stayed with that night. He said she called an Uber, but we had a nice conversation while she was waiting for the Uber, and that he helped her get into the car. I said, well, why would you remember her? And he went back to say she was very pretty, tall, blonde, had a great personality, and was comfortable talking to people. He was extremely helpful for me to set what was in her mind just prior to her being dropped off. So if you use all those things as an indicator, again, there's nothing to indicate that she was planning on doing something out of the norm. Approximately at 6:25 is when records indicate she actually got into the rideshare, and the rideshare took her over to Crissy Field and dropped her off there.
This is a popular drop-off spot if you want to walk the Golden Gate Bridge. It's right at the base of the bridge.
I did, in fact, contact the San Francisco police to see if I could get that rideshare driver's name and phone number so I could directly interview him. They did not provide that information to me. However, they did tell me that they interviewed him at length, and he actually was upset to learn that Sydney was missing. He didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. She wasn't in the back of his rideshare crying or anything like that. It was just a normal ride for him at 6:30 in the morning over to Crissy Field.
The rideshare driver cooperated fully with the San Francisco police and has been cleared.
I did also learn that her backpack had been found in bushes in Crissy Field. I also was told that her phone was missing out of the backpack, which led me to believe if she was planning on something, that she wouldn't have taken her phone. She hid her backpack. She didn't want to carry it around with her. When I contacted the United States Coast Guard, they never received any reports that somebody may have seen something floating in the waterway that was unusual. They never received any calls from boaters in regards to anything suspicious.
When a jump from the Golden Gate Bridge is witnessed, a patrol officer drops a flare into the water. The Coast Guard is usually able to get there within 4 to 5 minutes. They take that body to Fort Baker, and the Marin County coroner is able to do an autopsy and identify the body and usually notify the family. But unfortunately, if a jump is not witnessed, there's no way to track that body.
With the Coast Guard, because they're experts as far as the currents and stuff like that go specifically in that area. One of the questions I asked was if someone jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, is it a high probability the body would be found, or what type of probability? And they told me that there was a higher probability that the body would show up, or initially in the very beginning it would show up, and obviously that has not occurred yet. There's 2 specific railings that people would have to actually crawl up on, okay, and put their feet over to attempt to jump off of there. I'm not saying it's an impossible task, but at that hour, somebody would have seen her doing those movements. You've got cars, because it's bumper-to-bumper traffic. You've got bikes, you've got walkers, you've got tourists, and nobody saw this person whatsoever. It just doesn't make sense.
It will always go back to, if there's no body and proof, that we have to continue to believe that she's out there. There is no proof that Sydney ended her life. Without definitive proof, how could any parent stop looking? It's impossible. I
do not think Sydney jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. One of the questions that's asked me over and over is, do I still think Sydney's alive? And I think Sydney 100% is still alive.
Based off what I've read about this case and who I've talked to, as a journalist, you can't rule out anything just because there is not enough evidence. So there is no evidence of her jumping. Did she run away?
Sydney is highly intelligent. If she did not want to be found, she would know how to do that. She is a highly intelligent and independent young woman.
Even though Sydney had left Cal and was not living the life that she had envisioned for herself at that moment in time, she wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't just run away. She wouldn't just go off and not talk to us or not talk to somebody else close to us. One of her friends, one of her other family members out there, it was very abnormal to just suddenly have no contact whatsoever.
There's been no activity on her bank account, and she didn't really take any of her belongings with her if she did run away, so that theory is probably less, but you also can't rule it out.
Sydney's movements were consistent up until the point where she left the hotel. And then after that, it was just so uncharacteristic for her not to contact her family, not to text her sister, her younger sister. That was something she did all the time too. Her and her younger sister were very close. One of the things that I just can't let go of is the fact that the Bay Area is just a huge hub for human trafficking. So the totality of the whole situation made me believe that this, in fact, was probably foul play.
Sydney West was last seen September 30th, 2020. If you have any information, please contact Scott Dudek at 925-705-8328.
During the investigation, the first comment people make is how beautiful Sydney is. She's just a very beautiful young girl. And just based on her looks, her mannerisms, her personality, if she in fact chit-chatted with somebody on the bridge that could have lured her into a vehicle at some point, or maybe she hit it off with somebody or something like that. And one of my biggest theories or fears is that that's maybe what occurred to her, is somebody kidnapped her, recruited her, took her out of the area. I contacted probably in excess of 100 people over the course of the investigation in that area, right down to some of the girls, the streetwalkers and stuff, to see if in fact they knew of a pimp that would do something like this, take somebody just randomly. And they took the flyers so they could ask around for me, and they kept in contact. The cooperation has just been tremendous because it's really hard to break into that world. The girls are helpful to a certain extent, but they have to also worry about themselves.
A lot of people asked about, like, what about sex trafficking? That's huge in San Francisco, unfortunately. And so one of the avenues we checked early on when we were linking up with various organizations was with an organization that deals with sex trafficking. And they reviewed all the information and said, you know, we don't really see any indication that this would be that situation.
Another factor I also learned about Sydney is she did suffer a pretty severe concussion. Did in fact she have some kind of seizure or some kind of incident on the bridge that may have triggered her to get amnesia or something along that line.
Could Sydney have had a break in her memory? Yes. To me, it's as plausible as the alternative.
Sydney showed symptoms of post-concussion syndrome, which can lead to headaches, dizziness, memory loss, and amnesia, and it can last months, if not years, after the diagnosis.
But at the end of the day, it takes a singular tip that leads to her recovery.
I wasn't seeing a plan from the SFPD about what they were going to do to help find Sydney. There wasn't anything proactive. So we became proactive. So on October 9th, 2020, we set up a Find Sydney West Facebook page, Find Sydney West, where we put out lots of information and encourage people to share that so that it could kind of spread like wildfire across the country. Eventually, we also put together a findsydneywest.com website. Facebook was and is great for communicating, quick bits of information. But if we had long videos or music, links to news articles, those kinds of things, it really made sense to create a webpage.
That morning that Sydney was on the bridge, there was a lot of people that were near her. I know this because I reviewed the video. So we absolutely believe that somebody must know something.
So because it's almost 4 months now, and we are desperate to have our daughter back, we are offering a $10,000 reward to anybody who is able to locate and bring her home.
The community in Chapel Hill really came together for the West family, and they had gatherings where they were thinking and praying and trying to help the West family as much as possible.
That was part of the reason why we did vigils, to raise awareness, but also to let people, share their thoughts and come together.
The family of Sydney West now offering $25,000 for information on where she could be.
Another suggestion that I made was to look into setting up a billboard in areas that would lead to the Golden Gate Bridge where people would see that.
We were able to secure Berkeley on the 80 heading into the city, and then also the 680 heading up into the city from the south side of the bay. So these are two huge highways that lots and lots of people commute on, and we were able to get great electronic billboard space that looked amazing. It was just like one other way to get the word out there. So we were getting the word out, and there was news articles, and the reward was offered. Lots of different tips would come in. I got a whole bunch of texts from somebody who was saying all kinds of awful things. Sydney was pregnant. It somehow went into, if you don't move quick enough, she's not gonna be okay. And then that somehow, the person started telling me that she was gonna be sent to Mexico and her organs were gonna be harvested. I sent the phone number and the screenshots to the San Francisco police and discovered that they were just trying to provoke me.
With these type of investigations, it's like being on a roller coaster, and you spend all kinds of time and it just doesn't lead to anything.
I don't know if they were trying to get reward money, if they were trying to just play a joke on us, trying to just upset us. I have no idea. But it was just unfathomable that there were people out there who would do something like that to a family that was in this situation.
We can't overlook those tips, but unfortunately, the tips that are giving us false information, that they have her or they know her whereabouts, are related to getting the reward money, and those things are really difficult to deal with.
One of the interesting things that came out of that is we actually had multiple sightings from various people that did not know each other from the Santa Cruz area, which is a beach area. I thought was probably a potential for a good lead. Several people saw her playing an instrument and singing by a statue in Santa Cruz.
Santa Cruz, California, which is a surf town where I taught Sydney to surf. And so there's a place that she loved.
This tip was one of the strongest leads that I felt we were going to find her.
This tip was a little confusing because this person that looked like Sydney was in Santa Cruz. She was playing the guitar. I said, well, she never played the guitar, but maybe she learned how to play. Or if she was traveling with someone playing the guitar and she was singing, which made potentially more sense.
Her height, her hair, they said she kind of looked like she could have been homeless for a little while, which could be consistent if she maybe had forgotten where she had been or lost her memory totally.
We don't know exactly how Sydney's concussion plays into her disappearance, but they can affect your memory, and it can often lead to amnesia for months, even years after you get that concussion.
We were able to get our, friends and family from California to go down there to Santa Cruz and try to see who this person was. One good friend of mine did find a woman playing the guitar with somebody else that was kind of hanging out with her, who from the back maybe kind of looked like Sydney, but she got some photos and everything and actually went up and talked to these people after. And it clearly wasn't her. So it was disheartening and frustrating, and it just makes you feel like you're not getting anywhere.
On November 5th, 2021, I received a tip from an individual who thought they saw Sydney West outside of McDonald's on Bayshore Boulevard in San Francisco. They took some pictures of her. I thought there was a resemblance.
I looked at the picture and said, oh my God, that looks exactly like her.
It was sort of like a young woman who seemed maybe a little lost, or like something seemed a little off, that sort of raised the person's interest. They sent us photos, but I saw the photo and I was like, I feel like as a mom, I just would know, that's her. And I just didn't feel like it was.
In the end, we couldn't agree. I think I eventually took her opinion. It wasn't her, but it looked exactly like her. Emotionally, it's really difficult. It's just incredibly challenging, even when the tips are credible.
Now, here we are, 2.5 years later in this investigation, and I think the most important thing in regards to this is let's not have people forget about Sid. They need to see her. They need to understand what the family's all about. Her loved ones are still searching for her 2.5 years later, 24/7.
I definitely still have hope that Sydney's out there. But what I additionally have hope for is that there's somebody out there who saw something and knows something. That's what I'm really hopeful for, is that there's somebody who can help us figure out what happened.
Don't assume that you think you know what happened to her and dismiss it, because nobody knows what happened to her, including myself. So don't assume that you think based on your own circumstances that you wouldn't be a help. No, just keep an open mind and reach out.
If you see her, if you see the likeness of her, report it. We just want her home with us.
This has been a horrendous tragedy for our family, and it's still just unbelievable to me. Where is she? Seeing what Jay and Kimberly and what Faith goes through, to have her sister. I don't know how they'll ever get over that, how you move on. So difficult to live your life missing such a huge part of it. Just want to know where she is. Want her back at home and around people who love her and feeling that love.
Being Sydney's father is the greatest joy of my life. I loved every second of it. And that's all I wanted her to become, is just this wild kid that would literally reach for her dreams. And it's very important to me that people understand that it's not superhuman or anything. It's just loving your kid. So please help me find her.
If or when I see Sydney again, I would tell her that I love her and give her a huge hug and not let go for a long time.
Sometimes people ask me about wanting closure. And just to be very clear, the only closure I ever want is for my daughter to come home. I'm okay walking this earth the rest of my days, looking for her. If I can find her before the last day before I die, I'm good. Find your way home, Sid. Find your way home.
The call came in at 2:17 a.m. A whisper of panic slicing through the stillness of a quiet English suburb, a trembling voice reporting that the front door was open, the lights were on, and something felt terribly wrong inside the house on Hawthorne Lane. Within minutes, blue lights washed over neat hedges and identical brick facades, illuminating a street that had not seen so much as a broken window in decades. Inside number 14, the air was thick, metallic, wrong. A glass lay shattered near the kitchen sink. A chair overturned. And at the foot of the narrow staircase, sprawled against the wallpaper decorated with faded roses, was 32-year-old Emily Harper, motionless, her dark hair fanned across the carpet like spilled ink. She had been alive just hours earlier. Neighbors had seen her that evening, walking her dog, exchanging polite smiles, carrying a small grocery bag. She was ordinary in the way that made the violence unbearable. A primary school teacher, recently engaged, known for baking cupcakes for staff meetings and volunteering at the parish fete. There were no signs of forced entry. No obvious weapon. No defensive wounds that made sense. Just bruising around her throat, faint but deliberate, and a silence in the house that felt staged, almost rehearsed. By sunrise, Hawthorne Lane was sealed off. Reporters gathered at the cordon, microphones raised, voices hushed but hungry. Shock in quiet community. Young teacher found dead. Police probe mystery killing. The words rolled out across morning broadcasts, across front pages, across kitchen tables where families stared in disbelief. This was 2005. This was the United Kingdom. This was not supposed to happen here. Detective Inspector Mark Ellison arrived before dawn, coat collar turned up against the chill. He had seen violence before, London streets, drunken brawls turned fatal, domestic disputes that spiraled out of control, but something about this house unsettled him. There was no chaos beyond the minimum required. No ransacked drawers. No missing electronics. Her handbag was still on the hallway table, phone inside, untouched. The engagement ring on her finger glinted beneath the forensic lights. If this was robbery, it was the most selective robbery in memory. If it was passion, it was eerily restrained. Upstairs, the bed was neatly made. A book lay open on the nightstand, face down, as if she intended to return to it. The bathroom mirror still fogged faintly from a shower taken hours earlier. Time had frozen between routine and rupture. The post-mortem would later confirm manual strangulation. Slow. Personal. Close enough to hear breath falter. Close enough to feel life slip away. Her fiancé, Daniel Reed, was the one who found her. He had been staying at his flat across town that night, finalizing plans for their upcoming wedding. He arrived just before midnight, he said, because she had stopped answering her phone. At first, investigators noted the tremor in his voice, the way he clutched a crumpled tissue, the redness of his eyes. Grief, they assumed. Shock. But grief can mimic guilt, and guilt can masquerade as grief. Within hours, Daniel was no longer just the devastated partner. He was a person of interest. He told them they had argued earlier in the week. Nothing serious. Seating arrangements. Finances. The kind of trivial friction that precedes a ceremony, not a funeral. He swore he had not been at the house that night until he found her. CCTV from a petrol station seemed to place his car miles away around the estimated time of death. Phone records showed no calls between them after 9:43 p.m. Still, suspicion lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Forensic teams combed the property inch by inch. Fibers. Fingerprints. Footwear impressions. They found partial prints on the back door, smudged, incomplete. They lifted a single unfamiliar hair from the collar of her blouse, too short to be hers, too coarse to belong to Daniel. DNA technology in 2005 was advanced but not omniscient. The sample was degraded, fragmented. It yielded a partial profile, not enough for a definitive match. It was entered into the national database anyway, a digital message in a bottle cast into an ocean of offenders. The community spiraled. Parents kept children home from school. Curtains twitched whenever an unmarked car rolled past. Rumors bred in the vacuum of answers. A drifter seen near the park. A former colleague dismissed the previous year. A handyman who had fixed the boiler weeks before. Each name surfaced, flared, and faded under scrutiny. No one fit. No one stuck. Weeks turned into months. The funeral drew hundreds. White lilies lined the church steps. Daniel stood rigid beside the coffin, his face carved from stone. Some pitied him. Others watched him too closely. Investigators re-interviewed him repeatedly, dissecting timelines, testing for cracks. None appeared. His alibi held. His DNA did not match the trace found on Emily's blouse. Eventually, publicly at least, attention shifted. Behind closed doors, the case board grew crowded with photographs and red string. A timeline mapped in meticulous detail, last sighting at 7:15 p.m., phone activity at 9:43 p.m., estimated time of death between 10 and 11 p.m. A neighbor reported hearing a dull thud around 10:20, but dismissed it as a dropped object. Another recalled a car engine idling briefly outside, though he could not describe the vehicle. Each fragment tantalized. None formed a complete picture. The press labeled it a cold case, before the first anniversary had even passed. That word, cold, implied neglect, abandonment, frost settling over memory. But inside the major crime unit, it was anything but forgotten. Ellison returned to the file often, flipping through autopsy photos, reading witness statements until the sentences blurred. He was haunted not by what he saw, but by what he didn't. There was no sign of sexual assault. No theft. No clear motive. It felt targeted, yet inexplicable. In 2007, a new lead surfaced. A man arrested in Manchester for assault bore a loose resemblance to a composite sketch developed from vague witness accounts. His DNA was compared against the partial profile. Not a match. Another door closed. The file thickened, hope thinned. Daniel moved away in 2008, unable to bear the street, the whispers, the sideways glances in shops. Some interpreted his departure as flight. Others saw it as survival. He gave one final interview to a regional paper, voice cracking, as he insisted he wanted nothing more than the truth. "Whoever did this," he said, "is still out there." The headline screamed, "Fiancé's plea in unsolved killing." And then the cameras drifted elsewhere, to fresher tragedies, newer headlines. Years slipped by. Technology advanced. DNA analysis became more sensitive, more precise. In 2012, the evidence was re-examined. The tiny hair fragment, preserved carefully in an evidence bag, was sent to a modern lab. This time, scientists extracted additional markers, strengthening the partial profile. Still incomplete, still frustratingly shy of certainty, but clearer. It was enough to suggest the perpetrator was male, likely of local European ancestry. A revelation both helpful and useless in a country of millions. The case acquired a mythology. University students cited it in criminology lectures. Armchair detectives dissected it on early internet forums. Theories grew elaborate, cinematic. A secret admirer turned stalker, a jealous colleague, a contract killing disguised as domestic tragedy. Each theory carried a spark of plausibility, none withstood the weight of evidence. In 2015, 10 years after Emily's death, a cold case review unit reopened the investigation formally. Fresh eyes scanned old documents. Patterns were reconsidered. Detectives revisited Hawthorne Lane, knocking on doors that had changed hands since that night. One elderly resident mentioned something previously overlooked. A white van parked 2 streets away repeatedly in the weeks leading up to the murder. Delivery records were checked. Utility companies contacted. No clear link emerged. The van dissolved into the background noise of urban life. Ellison, now grayer, closer to retirement, attended the review meetings as a consultant. He listened as younger officers proposed possibilities he had already chased to exhaustion. He felt the familiar knot in his stomach when the conversation circled back to Daniel. Statistically, partners were often responsible. Emotionally, the narrative fit too neatly. But statistics are not proof, and proof was the one thing this case lacked. Another forensic push in 2018 leveraged emerging genealogical techniques. Investigators considered the possibility of using familial DNA searches, tracing partial matches to distant relatives in the database. Legal constraints slowed progress. Privacy debates raged nationally. Eventually, limited approval was granted. The partial profile was run again, this time not seeking a direct hit, but a whisper of kinship. A potential connection surfaced, distant, tentative, to a family in the Midlands. Detectives followed the thread cautiously, interviewing relatives, collecting voluntary samples. One by one, they were eliminated. The genetic trail thinned to nothing. Hope flared, then died, leaving behind a sharper disappointment than before. Meanwhile, Hawthorne Lane returned to its quiet rhythm. New families moved in. Children who had once been kept indoors grew into adults, who only vaguely remembered the police tape. The house at number 14 was renovated, repainted, its history unspoken during viewings. Yet for those who had been there in 2005, the memory lingered like a shadow at the edge of vision. In 2020, amid a global pandemic that overshadowed nearly all else, a small but significant development occurred. Advances in touch DNA analysis allowed laboratories to extract profiles from skin cells left by mere contact. The original evidence, Emily's blouse, the collar where that coarse hair had been found, was tested again. Scientists isolated additional genetic material, faint but distinct. It matched the strengthened partial profile from years earlier, confirming that the unknown male DNA was not contamination. It belonged to someone who had been close to her, close enough to grasp, to press, to kill. The profile was resubmitted. Weeks passed. Then, quietly, an alert. A near match in the national database, not exact, but close enough to indicate a first-degree relative. The name attached to the match was not Daniel Reed. It was a 28-year-old man arrested recently for burglary in a neighboring county. His DNA suggested he could be a brother or son of the unknown contributor. Detectives moved swiftly, tracing family records. The burglar had an older brother. 39 years old. Lived less than 15 miles from Hawthorne Lane in 2005. Worked sporadically as a delivery driver. Had a minor record, nothing violent, nothing that would have drawn serious attention. His name had never appeared in the original investigation. When officers knocked on his door in early 2021, he appeared confused but cooperative. He provided a DNA sample voluntarily, perhaps unaware of the net tightening around him. Days later, the lab confirmed it. A full match to the profile extracted from Emily Harper's blouse. 16 years after her death, the genetic ghost had a face. The arrest was quiet at first, procedural. Then the news broke. United Kingdom, 2005 murder mystery solved. Cold case breakthrough shocks nation. Cameras returned to Hawthorne Lane, to Daniel Reed, older now, lines etched deep, who stood speechless as reporters thrust microphones toward him. The community reeled, disbelief colliding with relief. Yet even with a name, questions remained. The suspect, when interrogated, denied knowing Emily. Denied ever entering her home. Confronted with the DNA evidence, he faltered but did not confess. Investigators theorized he may have targeted houses randomly, perhaps attempting burglary, perhaps surprised by a lone occupant. But the absence of forced entry still gnawed at them. Had she opened the door willingly? Had he posed as a delivery driver? The truth hovered just beyond reach. As the case moved toward trial, the narrative shifted from mystery to accountability, but the unease never fully dissipated. 16 years is a lifetime of waiting. 16 years of birthdays uncelebrated, of wedding plans turned to ashes. The resolution, when it came, was both explosive and muted, a legal answer to a question that had haunted a street, a family, a detective's career. And yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when Hawthorne Lane lies still and the wind brushes against brick and glass, some residents still remember the blue lights, the cordon, the whispered headlines. They remember that for years, the killer was just a shadow, a possibility in every passing stranger. They remember how fragile safety can be, how quickly ordinary life can fracture. The case may be labeled solved, stamped and archived, but the echo of that 2:17 a.m. call still reverberates, a reminder that beneath even the calmest streets, darkness can wait patiently, silently, for its moment to surface. The arrest should have been the end of it, a clean line drawn beneath 16 years of doubt, but instead it reopened the night in excruciating detail, dragging every forgotten second back into the light as if time itself had been summoned to testify. The suspect, Adrian Cole, delivery driver, older brother of a petty burglar, a man whose name had never once appeared in the original file, sat in a grey interrogation room beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like distant static, his expression caught somewhere between defiance and disbelief as detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece, photograph by photograph, the reconstructed DNA profile projected onto the wall like a digital fingerprint of fate. He insisted he had never met Emily Harper, never walked down Hawthorne Lane, never set foot inside number 14, yet science said otherwise, and science in 2021 spoke with a precision unimaginable in 2005. The touch DNA extracted from the collar of her blouse was no longer a faint whisper. It was a complete genetic signature, mapped, amplified, undeniable. His counsel argued secondary transfer, contamination, laboratory error, but each claim unraveled under scrutiny, because the evidence had been preserved meticulously, retested independently, verified by multiple analysts who had nothing invested in narrative, only in data. The numbers aligned. The alleles matched. The probability of coincidence was astronomically low. Investigators revisited his past with renewed urgency, combing through employment records, fuel receipts, delivery routes from the autumn of 2005, reconstructing a life that had once seemed too ordinary to examine closely. Back then he had worked for a regional courier service, subcontracted occasionally to larger distributors, including seasonal parcel overflow in suburban districts not far from Hawthorne Lane. There was no direct proof placing him outside Emily's home that night, no CCTV preserved after so many years, no surviving delivery logs detailed enough to pinpoint his movements, but the proximity alone tightened the narrative like a vice. He had been near. Close enough to know the layout of those streets. Close enough to notice patterns, lights on, curtains drawn, a woman living alone. Neighbors were interviewed again, their memories brittle, but still capable of producing fragments. One woman, now in her 70s, recalled a man in a dark jacket standing near a van 2 houses down several evenings before the murder, smoking, watching. At the time she assumed he was a contractor, perhaps waiting for a client. She could not be certain it was Adrian Cole. Years distort faces, and suggestion can reshape recollection, but her statement added texture to the void. Another resident remembered a knock at their own door weeks earlier, by someone claiming to confirm an address for a parcel. They had thought nothing of it. Routine. Harmless. In hindsight, everything looked sinister. Under sustained questioning, Adrian's composure cracked in subtle ways. His breathing quickened when shown crime scene photographs. He looked away from the image of the staircase where Emily had fallen. He repeated phrases, "I don't remember," I wasn't there, you're mistaken, as if rehearsed in advance. Detectives pressed on motive, on opportunity, on the inexplicable presence of his DNA against the skin of a woman who had died fighting for breath. He had no explanation beyond denial. For Daniel Reed, the news detonated quietly. 16 years of suspicion had followed him like a shadow, eroding friendships, altering careers, staining every introduction with an unspoken question. Even after being cleared formally, doubt had lingered in the minds of strangers who preferred simple stories: fiancé kills bride-to-be, jealousy, rage. Now, as headlines declared a breakthrough, he felt vindication tangled with grief, because the arrest did not restore what had been taken, it merely shifted the weight of accusation onto another pair of shoulders. The community's reaction oscillated between relief and unease. Relief that the phantom had a name. Unease that he had lived among them unnoticed, that he might have stood in queues at the same supermarket, fueled his car at the same petrol station, shared pavements without a flicker of recognition. The idea that danger can blend seamlessly into routine unsettles more deeply than any masked intruder. Prosecutors built their case methodically, aware that a cold case hinges on credibility as much as evidence. They emphasized the evolution of forensic science, explaining to jurors how degraded samples once dismissed as inconclusive could now be amplified, how genealogical cross-referencing narrowed possibilities from millions to one family line, how a single hair and a constellation of skin cells could outlast silence. Defense attorneys countered with the fragility of memory, the absence of eyewitness identification, the lack of direct motive. No prior connection between Adrian and Emily had been documented. No threatening messages. No stalking reports. They argued that DNA proves contact, not murder, and contact itself remained unexplained. Yet the prosecution's narrative coalesced around opportunity. A delivery driver accustomed to approaching doors, accustomed to polite smiles and routine exchanges, someone who could knock without raising alarm. If Emily had opened the door willingly, expecting a parcel, she would have stood within arm's reach. Close enough for sudden violence. Close enough for a struggle contained within a hallway. The lack of forced entry began to make sense under that lens, transforming from anomaly to indicator. As the pretrial hearings unfolded, journalists resurrected archival footage from 2005, grainy clips of police tape fluttering in cold wind, interviews with shaken neighbors speaking of unthinkable tragedy. The juxtaposition of past and present lent the case an almost cinematic symmetry, as if history had paused only to resume at the precise moment technology caught up with truth. Social media amplified every detail, every courtroom exchange dissected by amateur analysts, convinced they could see guilt flicker across Adrian's face during televised appearances. Inside the courtroom, however, the atmosphere was less theatrical and more suffocating. Emily's parents sat rigid in the front row, older now, hair silvered by years that had offered no answers. They listened as forensic experts described the mechanics of strangulation in clinical tones, as pathologists revisited the injuries documented in 2005, as technicians explained chain of custody protocols designed to eliminate contamination. Each technical explanation carried an emotional undertow, because behind the terminology lay the image of their daughter's final moments. Adrian maintained his plea of not guilty. He declined to testify, a legal right that fueled speculation, but proved nothing. The jury deliberated for days, poring over evidence that bridged 2 decades. When the verdict was finally read, guilty of murder, the words seemed to echo beyond the courtroom walls, reverberating back through 16 years of uncertainty. Sentencing followed, life imprisonment with a minimum term reflecting the gravity of a crime that had stolen not only a life, but also years of peace from an entire community. The judge spoke of calculated violence, of a predator exploiting trust, of the extraordinary perseverance of investigators who refused to let the file gather dust. Outside, cameras captured Emily's parents embracing, Daniel standing slightly apart, eyes closed as if absorbing the weight of finality. And yet, even in resolution, complexity lingered. Adrian never offered a full confession, never articulated motive, never filled the final gaps in the timeline. Without his words, the exact sequence inside number 14 remains partially obscured. Did he intend burglary and panic when confronted? Or did he select her deliberately, watching routines until opportunity crystallized? The court established guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but the intimate psychology of that night remains locked within a man who has chosen silence. For Detective Inspector Ellison, retirement arrived shortly after the conviction. He cleared his desk, boxed decades of case files, and paused over Emily's photograph one last time. Solved, the folder now read in bold letters, but he knew that solved is a legal designation, not an emotional one. It cannot restore the heartbeat that stopped on a staircase in 2005. It cannot erase the years when a street lived under suspicion, when a fiancé carried unearned blame, when a community learned how fragile normalcy truly is. Hawthorne Lane today appears unchanged to an untrained eye: trim hedges, parked cars, children cycling past number 14, without knowledge of the history embedded in its bricks. But beneath that surface lies a memory sharpened by time, a reminder that justice can move slowly, almost imperceptibly, before striking with sudden clarity. The mystery that once dominated headlines has been archived, catalogued, cited as a testament to forensic advancement and investigative persistence. Still, on quiet nights, when the street falls silent and lights dim one by one, there is an awareness that for 16 years a question hung unanswered in the air, and that it took patience, science, and an unwavering refusal to forget to finally let that question rest. The conviction closed the legal chapter, but it did not close the night, because the night had never truly belonged to the courtroom. It belonged to memory, to the fragments that still floated unanchored in the minds of those who had been there when the blue lights first bled across Hawthorne Lane. Even after the sentence was handed down, investigators continued to reconstruct the timeline with almost obsessive precision, as if by tightening every screw of detail, they could finally silence the lingering doubt that always shadows a case built across decades. Re-examination of archived call logs revealed something that had once seemed insignificant. At 10:12 p.m., minutes before the estimated time of death, Emily's landline registered an incoming call that lasted only 4 seconds. No voice message. No recorded conversation. Just a connection and an abrupt disconnect. In 2005, it had been dismissed as a misdial, the kind of technical glitch common before spam call regulations tightened. But in hindsight, detectives wondered whether it had been a test, someone confirming she was home, someone listening for the sound of her voice, the echo of a television, the subtle cues that signal vulnerability. Adrian Cole's phone records from that era were incomplete, a casualty of time and telecom retention policies, yet billing summaries suggested activity in a cell tower zone overlapping Hawthorne Lane that same evening. Defense attorneys had argued the data was too broad to pinpoint location. Prosecutors countered that coincidence had limits. The jury had sided with probability. Still, investigators revisited the technicalities: mapping tower ranges, traffic density, signal drift, building a three-dimensional model of coverage that placed Adrian's device within a radius that included number 14 during the critical window. Not proof in isolation, but confirmation layered upon DNA. Former colleagues of Adrian were interviewed again after the trial, freed from the constraints of active proceedings. One ex-supervisor recalled subtle complaints from customers in 2004 and 2005, nothing criminal, just unease. A woman who reported a driver lingering too long after delivering a parcel. Another who felt watched while signing for a package. The complaints had been too vague to escalate. No formal discipline followed. In a different context, perhaps they would have faded into obscurity. Now they glowed with retrospective menace. Psychologists consulted during sentencing had described Adrian as socially withdrawn, harboring resentments he rarely articulated. No documented history of violent assault. No record of stalking. Yet the absence of a record does not equate to absence of behavior, it often reflects absence of detection. The portrait that emerged was not of a master criminal, but of a man who drifted through routine interactions unnoticed, blending into the background of suburban life, learning its rhythms, absorbing its vulnerabilities. The prosecution's theory, never fully contested by evidence, suggested opportunism sharpened into fatal intent. A delivery uniform, even without official branding, carries implicit authority. Doors open. Names are exchanged. Smiles offered. If Emily had answered expecting a parcel, perhaps she stepped back to allow entry, perhaps she turned momentarily toward the hallway table where her handbag rested, and in that second proximity became leverage. The struggle appeared brief. Bruising patterns indicated force applied swiftly, decisively. No prolonged chase through rooms. No shattered furniture, beyond the single overturned chair. It was violence contained within meters. Yet one question persisted stubbornly: why her? Random selection satisfies legal thresholds, but rarely satisfies emotional logic. Investigators combed through Adrian's digital footprint from the mid-2000s, rudimentary by modern standards, limited browsing records, early social media platforms with sparse data retention. Nothing linked him directly to Emily. No shared acquaintances. No evidence of prior contact. The randomness, if genuine, intensified the horror. It meant vulnerability had been circumstantial, not personal. Emily's parents struggled with that possibility more than any other. In interviews after the verdict, they spoke of her warmth, her habit of trusting strangers, of offering tea to tradespeople working on the house. They wondered whether kindness had intersected fatally with calculation. They wondered whether caution could have altered the outcome, a thought that gnaws at survivors, because it implies control where none truly existed. Daniel Reed retreated from public view after the trial concluded. 4 years he had lived in a state of suspended identity, neither fully victim nor fully exonerated in the court of public opinion. Now, with Adrian convicted, invitations arrived, from documentary producers, podcast hosts, publishers eager to frame the story as a triumph of forensic science. He declined most of them. To him, the narrative was not a thriller. It was an absence that could not be monetized without reopening wounds. Privately, he visited the cemetery more often during that first year after the conviction, standing before the headstone that bore dates too close together, speaking into silence, as if time might still fold back on itself. Detective Inspector Ellison, though retired, followed post-conviction developments closely. Appeals were expected in a case so heavily reliant on modern forensic reinterpretation of old evidence. Defense lawyers filed motions challenging the admissibility of touch DNA analysis, questioning laboratory methodologies, raising concerns about secondary transfer in shared environments. Appellate courts reviewed transcripts, expert testimonies, chain of custody documentation preserved with near-archival reverence. The conviction was upheld. The science held. In professional circles, the case became a reference point, cited in seminars discussing the evolution of cold case strategy in the United Kingdom. It underscored the necessity of preserving evidence indefinitely, of resisting the temptation to close files prematurely, of embracing technological advances that can resurrect dormant investigations. Young detectives studied it as proof that patience can intersect with innovation to deliver justice long delayed. Yet amid institutional validation, the human residue remained complicated. Some residents of Hawthorne Lane admitted privately that they had grown accustomed to the unsolved status, that mystery had become part of the street's identity, a dark anecdote whispered to newcomers. The conviction disrupted that narrative, replacing ambiguity with a name, a face, a reality that felt both clarifying and destabilizing. Mystery allows imagination. Certainty imposes responsibility. In prison interviews conducted years into his sentence, Adrian continued to deny intentional murder. In one recorded statement submitted during a failed appeal, he suggested that if his DNA was present, it must have been through innocent contact, during a delivery gone wrong, that perhaps an argument escalated unexpectedly. The ambiguity of his phrasing, if, perhaps, gone wrong, struck observers as neither confession nor credible alternative. It was a fog designed to obscure more than reveal. Forensic specialists revisited the biomechanics of the assault one final time for academic publication, analyzing grip patterns, pressure distribution, and the absence of significant defensive injuries. Their conclusion reinforced the prosecution's theory. Surprise and proximity likely neutralized resistance quickly. The lack of extended struggle suggested she had little opportunity to fight back. The findings, though technical, carried a sobering implication: violence can unfold with terrifying efficiency, leaving minimal trace beyond the irreversible. Years after the conviction, Hawthorne Lane hosted a small memorial gathering on the 20th anniversary of Emily's death. No cameras. No headlines. Just candles placed along the pavement, neighbors old and new standing together in quiet acknowledgement. Some had been children in 2005, others had moved in long after the police tape was removed. They listened as Emily's former colleagues shared stories not of her death, but of her life, classroom laughter, school plays, handwritten notes to struggling students. In reclaiming her narrative from the crime, they attempted to shift focus from the act of violence to the person who had existed before it. The case file now rests in an archive, digitized, indexed, cross-referenced for training and research. On its cover, stamped in bold lettering, is the designation that once seemed impossible: solved. But the story resists reduction to a single word. It is a study in patience, in the slow march of scientific progress, in the resilience of families who refuse to let memory fade. It is also a cautionary tale about the ordinary facades behind which danger can reside, about the thin membrane separating routine from rupture. And so the night of October 14, 2005, continues to echo, not as an unanswered question anymore, but as a reminder that time does not dilute truth, it preserves it in fragments, waiting for tools sharp enough to extract it. The blue lights have long since vanished from Hawthorne Lane, the reporters dispersed, the headlines yellowed with age, yet beneath the quiet hum of modern life there remains an awareness that justice, though delayed, can arrive with the force of revelation, cutting through years of darkness in a single, irrevocable verdict. Long after the verdict, long after the headlines faded into archived web pages and courtroom sketches were boxed away, the question that refused to die was not whether Adrian Cole had killed Emily Harper, but how close the world had come to never knowing. Because if his younger brother had not been arrested for an unrelated burglary in 2020, if that routine DNA swab had not been entered into the national system, if genealogical cross-matching protocols had not evolved just enough to flag a partial familial link, the file might still be sitting in a cabinet labeled inactive, a quiet monument to uncertainty. The truth had not surfaced because someone confessed. It had not emerged from a dramatic witness revelation or a last-minute tip. It rose from data, cold, patient, mathematical data, waiting 16 years for a relative to make a mistake. When investigators reconstructed that chain of events, the fragility of justice felt almost unbearable. One arrest in another county. One procedural swab. One algorithm comparing allele markers across a national database. A digital tremor that rippled backward through time and landed on Hawthorne Lane like delayed thunder. In internal debriefings after the trial, senior officers dissected the original investigation with surgical honesty. They asked the uncomfortable questions. Could Adrian have been identified in 2005 if surveillance coverage had been broader? If delivery company employment logs had been retained more thoroughly? If touch DNA amplification had existed in its modern form? The answer to each question hovered in the same gray space, perhaps, but not certainly. Policing, like science, is bound by the tools of its era. In 2005, CCTV outside suburban homes was sparse. Data storage was limited. Delivery subcontracting created paper trails that evaporated within months. The forensic team had done what they could with what they had. They preserved the hair. They logged the fibers. They documented every bruise and indentation along Emily's neck. They kept the evidence cold and dry and sealed, not knowing that future technology would transform microscopic fragments into courtroom pillars. That preservation became the quiet hero of the story. As post-case analyses circulated within law enforcement circles, the Harper investigation was reframed not simply as a solved murder, but as a case study in delayed convergence, the moment when patience, evidence retention, and scientific innovation intersect. Conferences referenced it. Training manuals cited it. Young forensic analysts were shown side-by-side images, the 2005 lab report reading partial, insufficient for match, and the 2021 report declaring full profile confirmed. 16 years of advancement compressed into 2 sheets of paper. For Emily's parents, those documents were less symbolic and more visceral. They requested copies of the final forensic summary, not out of morbid curiosity, but because it represented certainty. 4 years they had lived in a purgatory of speculation. Now, in stark scientific language, the person responsible had been identified beyond reasonable doubt. Numbers replaced rumor. Probability replaced suspicion. It was not comfort, exactly, but it was solidity. Daniel Reed, meanwhile, grappled with a different aftermath. He had built a new life in another city, remarried, started a family, yet the trial reopened scars he had spent years learning to carry quietly. During the proceedings, defense strategy had briefly attempted to resurrect the old suspicion, suggesting that early investigative bias toward the fiancé had contaminated the direction of the case. Though the tactic failed, it forced Daniel to relive 2005 under oath, recounting arguments, timelines, alibis, the moment he found her at the foot of the stairs. Memory does not dull under cross-examination, it sharpens, cuts deeper. After the sentencing, he released a single written statement. Forgiveness was not his to grant, but he hoped the conviction would allow the community to breathe again. It was measured, restrained, absent of spectacle. He declined television interviews. He refused book deals. He understood something the public often forgets, that closure is a legal term, not an emotional state. Adrian Cole's appeal process dragged on for 2 years. His legal team focused heavily on the concept of secondary DNA transfer, presenting hypothetical scenarios in which genetic material might move from one surface to another without direct contact. They cited laboratory studies demonstrating transfer through shared objects, through handshakes, through environmental contamination. Experts countered with specifics: the concentration levels found on Emily's blouse, the absence of Adrian's DNA elsewhere in the home, the statistical improbability of accidental deposition precisely at the site of lethal contact. The appellate judges ultimately concluded that while secondary transfer is theoretically possible, the totality of evidence rendered it implausible in this case. Behind prison walls, Adrian's behavior oscillated between isolation and calculated normalcy. Psychological evaluations noted his continued refusal to articulate motive. He maintained a narrative of mistaken interpretation, suggesting that he may have delivered a parcel weeks earlier, and that some incidental contact explained the DNA. The timeline did not support it. Delivery records showed no scheduled stops at number 14 in the months before the murder. Yet he clung to ambiguity, perhaps because admitting intent would require confronting the reality of a life sentence not just legally imposed, but morally earned. For the residents of Hawthorne Lane, the 20th anniversary memorial marked a turning point. After years of defining themselves by what had happened there, they began redefining themselves by what endured. A small plaque was installed near the community green, not referencing the crime, but honoring Emily's dedication to local schools. It spoke of kindness, service, and resilience. The omission of violence was intentional, a refusal to let brutality monopolize memory. Still, on certain evenings when the air carries that same October chill, older residents admit they feel a flicker of recollection. The flashing lights. The cordon tape snapping in the wind. Reporters whispering into cameras about a quiet English suburb shattered by murder. Those phrases once echoed nationally. Now they linger only in personal memory and archived footage. Detective Inspector Ellison, in retirement, occasionally lectures at policing seminars. When he speaks of the Harper case, his tone is measured, devoid of dramatics. He emphasizes discipline, meticulous documentation, evidence preservation, resisting tunnel vision. He recounts how early suspicion toward Daniel, statistically justified, could have hardened into bias if not continually challenged. He reminds audiences that the real perpetrator lived unnoticed for years, his anonymity protected not by genius, but by technological limitation. He also speaks about patience. About accepting that some answers will not come quickly. About trusting that progress, though incremental, accumulates. What lingers most about the case is not the spectacle of arrest, or the gravity of sentencing, but the thin thread by which resolution hung. A brother's burglary. A routine DNA swab. A database comparison executed in seconds. 16 years balanced on a line of code. In another timeline, Adrian's brother never offends. The DNA never enters the system. The partial profile remains an unresolved fragment. Emily's case joins the ranks of permanent mysteries, cited in documentaries as a haunting example of violence without accountability. Instead, chance intersected with diligence, and the fragment found its match. There is a quiet, almost unsettling lesson embedded in that reality. Justice can depend on variables as unpredictable as human behavior itself. It is not always a straight path from crime to consequence. Sometimes it is a circle that takes decades to close. And so Hawthorne Lane lives on, its houses repainted, its gardens trimmed, children laughing on pavements that once held forensic tents. The archive reads solved. The courts have spoken. The sentence is being served. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary life remains the awareness that for 16 years, a single unanswered question hovered over a community, and that it was answered not by dramatic revelation, but by the slow, relentless advance of science catching up with silence. What the public never fully saw was how close the case came to collapse even after the arrest, how a single procedural misstep could have fractured 16 years of waiting into nothing more than renewed doubt. Behind the polished headlines announcing a breakthrough, there were nights when prosecutors stared at laboratory reports under harsh office lights, searching for weaknesses the defense would inevitably exploit. Cold cases are fragile by nature. Time corrodes memory, blurs context, erodes certainty. The Harper investigation survived because every fragment had been handled as if it might one day carry the entire weight of truth. In the months leading up to trial, forensic analysts reconstructed the original evidence storage logs from 2005. Every transfer of the blouse, every temperature-controlled locker entry, every signature was audited. Defense attorneys demanded proof that the garment had never been compromised, that no technician's stray skin cell could have introduced contamination. The prosecution responded with documentation so meticulous it bordered on obsessive, barcodes scanned, timestamps preserved, laboratory access restricted to named personnel. The chain of custody was not merely intact, it was airtight. Yet even airtight systems breathe under pressure. During pretrial motions, a junior lab technician disclosed that in 2006, the evidence box containing Emily's clothing had been temporarily relocated within the storage facility during a renovation. The move had been logged, but the defense seized on the detail, arguing that any relocation created opportunity for contamination. Courtroom air thickened as experts debated airflow patterns, packaging integrity, the probability of foreign DNA infiltrating sealed containers. In the end, independent forensic auditors testified that the packaging had remained undisturbed, the seals unbroken. The relocation was procedural, not compromising. The judge ruled the evidence admissible. A collective exhale followed, but only briefly. Outside legal chambers, the media narrative shifted from simple triumph to complex scrutiny. Talk radio questioned the reliability of modern DNA interpretation. Editorials debated privacy concerns surrounding familial database searches. Civil liberties groups warned of slippery slopes. If distant relatives could implicate suspects, where did consent end and surveillance begin? The Harper case became more than a murder trial. It became a national conversation about technology and accountability. For Emily's parents, those debates felt abstract and distant. They were less concerned with policy and more with presence, with sitting in a courtroom and hearing, finally, that the genetic code linking Adrian Cole to their daughter was not speculation, but certainty. They listened as scientists translated complex allele sequences into plain language. The probability that this DNA profile belongs to anyone other than the defendant is less than 1 in a billion. Numbers that vast are difficult to comprehend, yet emotionally they carried one simple message: this is him. Adrian's defense strategy pivoted as the trial progressed. Unable to dismantle the DNA evidence directly, they sought to erode motive. They painted him as socially awkward but non-violent, a man with minor infractions, but no history of brutality. They emphasized the absence of eyewitnesses, placing him inside number 14. They underscored the lack of a confession. In doing so, they relied on a subtle psychological principle. Jurors often search for narrative cohesion, a story that feels complete. Without motive articulated clearly, doubt can germinate. Prosecutors countered with behavioral analysis. They presented expert testimony explaining how opportunistic offenders often leave minimal pre-incident footprints. Not every predator escalates visibly. Some operate within narrow windows of opportunity, striking once, blending back into routine life. The absence of prior violence does not negate capability, it sometimes amplifies shock. One particularly haunting piece of evidence emerged late in proceedings. A fiber comparison linking microscopic threads from Adrian's work jacket, preserved from a 2005 employment archive, to fibers found on the hallway carpet beneath Emily's body. The match was not singular proof, but it reinforced proximity. Layer by layer, the case solidified like sediment under pressure. When the guilty verdict was delivered, relief rippled outward, but it was a relief tempered by awareness of fragility. Had that jacket not been retained in a company storage locker? Had the blouse not been preserved? Had the brother not committed burglary? Justice, in this instance, balanced on contingencies. In prison, Adrian's world contracted to concrete walls and regimented routine. Appeals failed. Media interest waned. The intensity that once surrounded his name faded into periodic true crime retrospectives. Yet within the corrections system, psychologists continued to evaluate him, searching for insight into motive that had never been articulated publicly. Their reports described a pattern of suppressed resentment, perceived social rejection, and a tendency to externalize blame. Nothing theatrical. Nothing cinematic. Just a quiet accumulation of grievance. For Hawthorne Lane, the transformation was subtle but profound. Property values, once rumored to dip after the murder, stabilized long ago. New families occupied number 14, aware of its history, but unwilling to let it define their present. Children rode bicycles past the staircase window without knowledge of the shadow that once lingered there. Time, indifferent and relentless, layered fresh memories over old trauma. Yet anniversaries still carry weight. On the 21st year after Emily's death, local news ran a brief segment, not about the crime itself, but about advances in forensic science inspired by cases like hers. The framing shifted from tragedy to progress. Viewers saw lab technicians manipulating samples under sterile hoods, algorithms scanning databases in milliseconds. They saw, implicitly, how far the system had come since 2005. Detective Inspector Ellison watched that segment from his living room, a quiet observer of a case that had once consumed his professional life. He reflected not on the drama of arrest, but on the patience required to resist despair during the long unsolved years. Cold cases test resolve in ways active investigations do not. They demand belief without immediate reward. They require faith that preservation today may yield clarity tomorrow. Emily's former school established a small scholarship in her name, awarded annually to students pursuing education degrees. In classrooms where she once taught, her photograph hangs not as a symbol of violence but of dedication. Teachers who knew her share stories with new staff, not of the crime, but of her laughter, her meticulous lesson plans, her habit of staying late to help struggling pupils. In doing so, they reclaim narrative ground from the darkness. Still, beneath the surface of resolution lies an unspoken understanding. The system worked this time, eventually, but only because fragments survived long enough to be reinterpreted. How many other cases rest dormant, waiting for similar convergence? How many partial profiles sit in databases, incomplete yet potent, waiting for a relative's misstep to unlock them? The Harper case lingers in professional memory as both caution and inspiration. Caution, because it illustrates how easily a perpetrator can vanish into normalcy when technology lags behind crime. Inspiration, because it proves that silence is not always permanent. Evidence does not expire if preserved with care. Truth does not decay simply because years accumulate. And so the story continues to echo, not in courtrooms now, but in laboratories, in training academies, in the quiet determination of investigators who refuse to discard a file simply because it has aged. On Hawthorne Lane, the wind still moves through hedges the same way it did in October 2005. The staircase still stands inside number 14, repainted, renovated, but structurally unchanged. Life advances. Children grow. Gardens bloom and wither and bloom again. Yet embedded in the bricks of that house is a reminder that justice can travel slowly, almost invisibly, across decades, before arriving with unmistakable clarity. 16 years of unanswered questions condensed into a single word spoken in court: guilty. A word that closed a chapter without erasing the past, a word that proved that even when darkness lingers, it does not always win the final page. Even after the sentence settled into permanence, even after appeals were exhausted and the legal machinery fell silent, there remained one dimension of the Harper case that refused to rest: the psychological shadow cast by 16 years of not knowing. Because while the courts delivered a verdict in 2021, the community had been living with uncertainty since 2005, and uncertainty reshapes people in ways that verdicts cannot simply undo. For years, Hawthorne Lane functioned under a quiet siege mentality. Parents walked children to school in pairs. Motion sensor lights multiplied along brick facades. Neighborhood watch groups formed, disbanded, reformed. Every unfamiliar van triggered suspicion. Every knock at the door carried a flicker of hesitation. That prolonged vigilance rewired instinct. Even after Adrian Cole's conviction, some residents admitted privately that they still checked locks twice before bed, not because the killer was free, but because fear had embedded itself too deeply to be reasoned away. Criminologists later studied the Harper case, not only for its forensic trajectory, but for its sociological impact. A single act of violence in a low-crime suburban enclave had generated ripple effects measurable in community cohesion, property behavior, even local policing patterns. Calls reporting suspicious persons spiked for nearly 3 years after the murder. Trust, once fractured, reassembled slowly and unevenly. Inside number 14, renovations erased visible traces of the past. New flooring replaced the hallway carpet. The staircase was sanded and repainted. Walls were stripped, replastered, modernized. Yet structural space retains memory in intangible ways. Owners who moved in years later reported an odd phenomenon. Visitors often grew quiet in the hallway, as if sensing gravity without context. It was not superstition, it was narrative residue. Stories linger even when surfaces change. Meanwhile, the national conversation about cold cases intensified in the wake of the conviction. Law enforcement agencies across the United Kingdom initiated audits of dormant files, prioritizing those with preserved biological evidence. Funding increased for forensic laboratories specializing in degraded sample recovery. The Harper case became shorthand for possibility, proof that time alone does not extinguish solvability. Behind the scenes, however, investigators acknowledged a more sobering truth: not every case benefits from such fortunate convergence. The Harper file contained preserved clothing, recoverable DNA, and a perpetrator, whose relative eventually entered the database. Many older cases lack one or more of those variables. Evidence may have been discarded under outdated retention policies. Samples may have degraded beyond recovery. Offenders without relatives in national systems remain statistical ghosts. That reality tempered celebration with realism. For Emily's parents, the years following the conviction unfolded in quieter ways. Grief did not spike dramatically, it shifted texture. Before the arrest, grief was entangled with injustice, sharpened by the absence of accountability. Afterward, it became more contemplative, less jagged but no less present. They described an unexpected sensation, relief accompanied by exhaustion. 16 years of mental vigilance, of reading news alerts, of bracing for updates, had conditioned them into a state of readiness. When the case concluded, that readiness had nowhere to go. Daniel Reed faced a different recalibration. The exoneration embedded in Adrian's conviction removed lingering suspicion, yet it also dismantled the adversarial clarity he had unconsciously relied upon. For years, he had directed anger toward an unknown figure. Now that figure had a name and a prison cell. Rage without a target is chaotic, rage with a target is contained. Once containment occurred, what remained was absence. He later confided to a close friend that closure felt less like triumph and more like silence. In prison, Adrian adapted to routine with the mechanical discipline of someone who understands the long horizon ahead. Behavioral reports described compliance, limited social interaction, no major infractions. He participated in mandatory rehabilitation programs, but continued to resist articulating a full narrative of the crime. Psychologists noted a consistent deflection pattern, minimizing intent, reframing circumstances, avoiding the pivotal moment of choice. Without confession, motive remains partially speculative. That silence frustrates investigators even in retirement. Ellison once remarked, during a lecture, that solving a case legally does not equate to solving it psychologically. We proved who, he told a room of recruits. We proved how. But why lives in a place evidence can't always reach? It was not a romantic statement, it was a professional limitation. Media interest eventually shifted, but periodic documentaries resurrected the timeline with dramatic reenactments: the knock at the door, the hallway struggle, the flicker of a porch light in the dark. These productions reignited public memory, sometimes simplifying complexity into digestible arcs. Families watched with mixed feelings. Awareness preserved legacy, yet dramatization risked reducing lived trauma to entertainment. In academic circles, the case influenced curriculum on evidence retention policy. One legislative review even cited it while debating standardized national guidelines for biological sample preservation beyond initial statutory limits. Lawmakers argued that indefinite retention imposes storage costs, but prevents irreversible loss. Opponents raised civil liberties concerns. Ultimately, retention periods were extended for serious violent crimes. Quiet policy shifts often carry the deepest impact. Back on Hawthorne Lane, generational turnover continued. Teenagers who had once whispered about the unsolved murder grew into homeowners themselves. Some chose to remain, determined not to let a single night define an entire postcode. Community events regained normalcy, barbecues, holiday light competitions, summer fetes echoing with laughter. Safety, once fragile, felt less theoretical. Yet there is a subtle difference between innocence and restored trust. Innocence assumes harm is unlikely. Restored trust acknowledges harm occurred and believes safeguards are stronger now. Hawthorne Lane evolved from the former to the latter. Each October, a few residents still leave flowers discreetly near the small plaque on the green. No ceremony. No speeches. Just quiet remembrance. The plaque does not mention Adrian Cole. It does not recount forensic breakthroughs. It honors Emily Harper, teacher, daughter, friend. In that restraint lies a deliberate choice, to define memory by life rather than death. The Harper case now occupies a peculiar place in criminal justice history. It is neither the most notorious nor the most complex. It lacks serial elements, lacks elaborate conspiracy. Its power lies in ordinariness disrupted and restored through persistence. A suburban home. A delivery driver. A preserved fragment of DNA bridging two technological eras. 16 years separated crime from conviction. In that span, smartphones replaced landlines, social media reshaped communication, forensic algorithms advanced exponentially. Society transformed. Yet one thing remained constant: the quiet determination embedded in a sealed evidence bag labeled October 2005. The blue lights that once bathed Hawthorne Lane in emergency glare exist now only in memory and archived footage. The call at 2:17 a.m. is preserved in digital logs, time-stamped and stored. The staircase stands. The hallway holds new footsteps. The world moves forward, indifferent yet connected. Justice, in this story, did not arrive dramatically. It accumulated. It waited. It depended on preservation, probability, and a single familial link surfacing at the right moment in time. And even now, with the perpetrator incarcerated and the case officially closed, the deeper echo remains, a reminder that beneath the calm surfaces of ordinary life, truth can sleep for years, silent but intact, until science and patience finally wake it. Years after the courtroom lights dimmed and the prison doors closed behind Adrian Cole, the Harper case continued to reverberate in quieter, more complicated ways, through conversations in academic halls, through policy reforms buried in parliamentary subcommittees, through the restless minds of investigators who understood that one solved case does not erase the hundred still waiting in silence. What distinguished this case was not brutality alone, but duration. 16 years is long enough for a neighborhood to reinvent itself, long enough for technology to leap forward in generational strides, long enough for suspicion to calcify into something almost permanent. During those years, Hawthorne Lane carried an invisible weight. Estate agents avoided mentioning number 14 unless directly asked. Local parents warned teenagers about answering doors at night. Fear did not dominate daily life, but it hovered, ambient, persistent. After the conviction, researchers from a London university conducted interviews with residents who had lived on the street in 2005. Their findings were unsettling. Many admitted they had privately suspected Daniel Reed at some point, despite the lack of proof. Statistics about intimate partner violence had shaped instinct. The absence of an identified outsider had narrowed blame inward. It was a stark reminder of how quickly narrative fills vacuum. When facts are incomplete, the human mind constructs coherence, even at the cost of fairness. Daniel learned of those interviews indirectly. He did not express anger publicly. But friends say the knowledge cut deeply. Being formally cleared by law is one thing, being quietly judged by neighbors for years is another. His life had unfolded under a cloud he did not create. The conviction lifted it legally, yet scars remain where suspicion once pressed hardest. Inside the forensic community, the Harper file became required reading. It illustrated the power, and the peril, of evolving science. Experts emphasized the importance of context when interpreting touch DNA. They taught young analysts to avoid overstating conclusions, to distinguish between presence and activity level, to communicate probability with precision rather than drama. The lesson was clear: technology can illuminate truth, but only disciplined interpretation ensures justice. Adrian Cole's refusal to confess continued to perplex observers. Some speculated it was strategic, a final assertion of control. Others believed denial had fused with self-perception over time, that acknowledging the act would fracture the psychological framework he relied upon to function. Prison therapists documented consistent patterns of minimization. He described himself as unlucky, misunderstood, targeted by circumstance. The narrative always curved away from accountability. In rare interviews conducted for correctional assessments, he hinted at resentment toward people who had everything handed to them. Investigators parsed those words, searching for echoes of motive. Was Emily symbolic? Did her perceived stability ignite something corrosive? Without explicit admission, interpretation remains speculative. Courts demand proof beyond reasonable doubt. Psychology often operates within shaded inference. Meanwhile, advances in forensic genealogy accelerated nationally. Inspired in part by cases like Harper's, law enforcement expanded protocols for identifying suspects through distant familial matches. Civil rights advocates raised alarms about privacy, urging transparent oversight. Parliamentary debates cited real-world examples, including the Harper breakthrough, as evidence of both promise and risk. Policy evolved cautiously, balancing investigative capability with civil liberty protections. On Hawthorne Lane, the passage of time softened edges, but did not erase them entirely. Residents who moved in after 2010 often learned of the murder only through online searches. Some felt uneasy initially, then rationalized, crime can occur anywhere, this one has been resolved. The house itself no longer stands out. Its brickwork blends seamlessly with neighbors. Curtains open and close without attracting scrutiny. Life insists on normalcy. Yet certain details remain frozen in communal memory: the sound of helicopters overhead in 2005, the sharp scent of forensic chemicals in autumn air, the low murmur of reporters rehearsing lines about a quiet suburb shattered. Memory does not replay continuously, it flickers during anniversaries, during news of other cold cases solved after decades. Each breakthrough elsewhere triggers a subtle echo: if it could happen there, it could have happened here. Detective Inspector Ellison, now well into retirement, occasionally revisits his old notebooks. The Harper case occupies several pages filled with tight handwriting, early theories circled and crossed out, witness names underlined. In the margins beside Daniel Reed's name is a notation from 2006, alibi consistent. No forensic link. Ellison once admitted privately that he feared tunnel vision during those early months. The statistical probability pointing toward the fiancé had been compelling. It required conscious effort to keep alternatives alive. That discipline ultimately preserved space for truth to emerge years later. Cold cases teach humility. They expose the limits of immediate knowledge and the necessity of doubt. In 2005, the absence of forced entry confounded investigators. In hindsight, it became a silent indicator of deception, authority assumed, trust exploited. What once seemed anomaly transformed into explanation under a new lens. The Harper file also influenced evidence retention culture within smaller police departments. Rural constabularies, often constrained by budget, reconsidered storage policies for biological material. The cost of indefinite preservation was weighed against the moral cost of irreversible loss. More facilities upgraded climate control systems. More departments digitized catalogs. Quiet investments made with future cases in mind. For Emily's parents, aging introduced another layer of urgency. They expressed gratitude that the conviction occurred within their lifetime. The idea that justice might have arrived too late for them to witness had haunted earlier years. Now, though grief remains permanent, it coexists with resolution. They no longer scan headlines hoping for updates. They attend memorials focused on her life, not the investigation. The Harper case is often described as solved, yet that word compresses complexity into simplicity. It suggests finality, without acknowledging the years of suspended animation that preceded it. It implies restoration, without fully accounting for transformation. Communities do not revert to their pre-trauma state, they evolve into something shaped by memory. In academic journals, the case appears in footnotes discussing probabilistic genotyping, familial database ethics, and long-term evidence viability. In policing seminars, it is recounted as an example of perseverance intersecting with innovation. In Hawthorne Lane's lived reality, it is remembered as a night when sirens pierced ordinary silence and altered perception forever. And still, beneath all analysis and policy debate, there remains the original image. A quiet English street under cold October stars, a front door opened without suspicion, a hallway that became a crime scene in seconds. That moment cannot be undone by conviction. It cannot be retroactively shielded by technological advancement. It exists permanently in time. Justice arrived 16 years late, carried not by confession, but by code, not by witness, but by data. It arrived because evidence was preserved when it might have been discarded. It arrived because probability converged with opportunity. And its arrival reshaped more than one man's fate. It reshaped trust in the slow, methodical power of persistence. Hawthorne Lane sleeps peacefully now. The lights go out one by one each night, without fear of an unseen predator walking free. But the story embedded in its bricks continues to speak quietly to those who listen, a testament to patience, to caution, to the knowledge that truth, however delayed, can endure long enough to be found. There is a moment in every long investigation, when fatigue threatens to eclipse faith, when the weight of years presses so heavily that even seasoned detectives begin to wonder whether the file in front of them will ever transform from question to answer. In the Harper case, that moment came and went more than once. It arrived in 2009 when promising leads dissolved into nothing. It resurfaced in 2013, when renewed forensic testing yielded only partial clarity. It hovered again in 2018, when familial DNA searches produced distant matches that unraveled under scrutiny. Each time, the case seemed to inhale hope and exhale disappointment. And yet, it never fully went dark. Within the Major Crime Review Unit, the Harper file was marked with a subtle distinction: viable. Not active in the daily operational sense, but viable, meaning preserved evidence still held latent potential. That single designation prevented it from sliding into the category where boxes gather dust and institutional memory fades. Viable meant periodic review. Viable meant budget allocation, for retesting when technology advanced. Viable meant someone, somewhere, remained responsible for remembering. When Adrian Cole's brother was arrested in 2020 for burglary in a neighboring county, the DNA swab taken at booking followed routine procedure. No fanfare. No awareness that it would trigger a chain reaction. His profile entered the national database and was algorithmically compared against millions of stored samples, including partial and familial entries. The Harper DNA profile, strengthened in 2012 and again in 2018, had been flagged for such comparisons. The system did not shout. It generated a notification, possible first-degree relative match. From there, human judgment resumed control. Analysts reviewed allele overlap, calculating likelihood ratios, estimating degrees of kinship. A sibling relationship emerged as statistically probable. Investigators cross-referenced family records. Adrian Cole's name surfaced not because he was on a suspect list, but because biology linked him indirectly to evidence sealed since 2005. That moment, quiet, procedural, data-driven, was the true turning point. When officers approached Adrian for a voluntary DNA sample, they did so cautiously, aware that premature confrontation could compromise admissibility. He agreed without visible alarm. Perhaps he believed the inquiry related to his brother's offense. Perhaps he underestimated the reach of forensic science. The sample was collected, processed, compared. The match was absolute. Internally, investigators described the confirmation as electric. Years of suspended possibility crystallized into certainty in a matter of hours. Yet even then, caution prevailed. Warrants were secured. Evidence was revalidated independently. No step could be rushed after 16 years of waiting. During interrogation, Adrian maintained composure initially, answering background questions with measured neutrality. But when confronted with the DNA results, something shifted, a tightening of jaw muscles, a pause half a second too long before denial. Detectives, who had spent careers reading microexpressions, recognized the fracture line. Not a confession. Not yet. But pressure had found its point. As the prosecution prepared its case, analysts reconstructed Adrian's life in 2005 with forensic granularity. Employment schedules, fuel purchases, bank transactions, even supermarket loyalty card data was examined for location markers. The picture that emerged was not flamboyant criminality, but mundane movement, work routes passing within miles of Hawthorne Lane, evenings unaccounted for in precise detail. The ordinary can conceal the catastrophic. One question dominated internal briefings: premeditation or opportunity. Evidence suggested no prolonged stalking, no obsessive contact. Yet delivery work offered natural reconnaissance. Repeated exposure to neighborhoods breeds familiarity. Familiarity breeds assessment. A lit window. A solitary occupant. Patterns observed subconsciously until one night they align with impulse. The absence of forced entry, once baffling, now appeared logical. A man holding a parcel, wearing neutral work attire, evokes compliance. Doors open reflexively. Trust operates faster than suspicion. In courtroom testimony, forensic experts demonstrated how skin cells transfer during physical struggle. Jurors watched animations depicting contact pressure along a collar, explaining how epithelial cells embed in fabric fibers under force. Science translated violence into diagrams, stripping it of mystery while reinforcing its reality. Adrian's defense leaned heavily on doubt. They questioned whether DNA could have transferred through a handshake during a prior delivery. They posited that he might have visited weeks earlier, leaving trace material that persisted unnoticed. Prosecutors countered with degradation analysis. Skin cells exposed to environmental factors degrade over time. The concentration found on Emily's blouse suggested recent transfer relative to the date of death. The timing aligned with fatal contact, not distant routine interaction. Beyond legal mechanics, the emotional undertow intensified. Emily's mother attended every session, her gaze steady, absorbing testimony that reconstructed her daughter's final minutes in clinical detail. The hallway became a focal point in proceedings, a narrow corridor transformed into the stage of irreversible violence. Photographs projected onto courtroom screens revealed subtle bruising patterns, each one a silent witness finally allowed to speak through science. Outside, media crews chronicled each development. Headlines evolved from cold case breakthrough to DNA evidence takes center stage. Commentators debated the reliability of touch DNA. Public fascination swelled, then stabilized as trial rhythm replaced dramatic revelation. When the guilty verdict was announced, the reaction was less explosive than many anticipated. There was no audible gasp, no theatrical collapse. Instead, a heavy stillness settled, as if the air itself acknowledged the weight of finality. 16 years of speculation, condensed into a single, irreversible determination. Yet even in resolution, complexity lingered. Adrian offered no full account of that night. No narrative confession detailing sequence, motive, intention. The legal system does not require emotional disclosure once evidentiary thresholds are met. But absence of explanation leaves a hollow space where understanding might reside. In subsequent years, criminologists analyzed the case through the lens of routine activity theory, how convergence of motivated offender, suitable target, and absence of capable guardianship can generate spontaneous violence. Emily's murder fit that framework with chilling precision. A motivated individual moving through neighborhoods under the guise of employment. A solitary occupant unaware of imminent threat. A narrow window of opportunity devoid of witnesses. Back on Hawthorne Lane, life persisted with understated resilience. Children who had once been kept indoors during the early years of uncertainty now walked home alone again. Porch lights remained bright, but fear no longer dictated their installation. The plaque on the green weathered seasons quietly, its inscription honoring life rather than recounting death. The Harper case now stands as a testament to convergence, of preservation and progress, of patience and probability. It reminds investigators that evidence sealed today may speak tomorrow, in ways unimaginable at the moment of collection. It reminds communities that unanswered questions need not remain permanent. And still, beneath the legal closure and academic analysis, there remains the original rupture, a knock at a door, a hallway dimly lit, a trust extended and betrayed within seconds. That moment cannot be undone by verdict or sentence. It remains suspended in time, a fixed point from which 16 years radiated outward before circling back to justice. The blue lights that once illuminated Hawthorne Lane are long gone. The sirens have faded into memory. But the lesson endures, steady and unflinching. Truth may travel slowly, obscured by years and silence, yet when preserved carefully and pursued relentlessly, it can still find its way home. The first anniversary arrived like a bruise pressed too hard. Flowers wilted against the iron fence outside the narrow terrace house. Photographs, laminated against rain, stared out at passing strangers. A smiling face frozen in 2005. A life paused mid-sentence. Reporters returned with cameras and solemn expressions. The phrase resurfaced in bold letters across front pages, cold case. Unsolved. Community still in shock. Inside the station, the box of evidence waited on a metal shelf. Dust clung to its corners. Exhibit bags sealed and resealed over the years. Statements typed on yellowing paper. A DVD labeled CCTV, High Street, 2217. A mobile phone wrapped in static-proof plastic. Fibers in envelopes. A fragment of something that might have been nothing. Time had not erased the murder. It had fossilized it. Detective Inspector Martin Hale reopened the file, because he could not stand the weight of it anymore. 15 years on the force. Promotions, transfers, commendations. But this case lingered. The one that slipped. The one that refused to close. He requested a review quietly, almost apologetically. Senior officers hesitated. Resources were thin. Priorities elsewhere. But the public memory had not faded, and a local journalist had begun asking questions again. The high street had changed. New shops. Brighter signage. Security cameras sharper, smarter. Back in 2005, the footage was grainy, black and white. Shadows moved like ghosts. A figure crossing the road at 22:17. Another shape lingering near the bus stop. No clear faces. No clean angles. Just movement. Hale watched the footage again in a darkened room. Over and over. Freeze frame. Rewind. Zoom. The same restless choreography. A person steps into frame. Pauses. Turns their head. As if listening. Listening to what? He compared timestamps with phone records. The victim had made a call at 22:12. Short. 30 seconds. To a contact saved only as D. The call had been traced. Interviewed. Cleared. Alibi confirmed by 2 colleagues and a swipe card log at a warehouse across town. Solid. Solid on paper. Hale leaned back, eyes burning. He had learned something over the years: alibis are structures. They can look like fortresses and still be hollow inside. He reopened interviews. Not publicly. Quietly. A knock on doors long closed. Some people welcomed the chance to speak again. Others bristled. We already told you everything. Why now? It's been years. Because someone knows something, Hale thought. Because the silence feels manufactured. A former neighbor mentioned a car. Dark blue. Parked awkwardly near the alley that night. It had come up before. Logged. Dismissed. The registration plate partially noted, but never fully confirmed. The DVLA search had returned too many possibilities. Hundreds of blue vehicles in a 10-mile radius. But technology had advanced. Image enhancement. Pattern recognition. The old footage was sent to a specialist unit. Days later, a call came in. We can't perform miracles, the analyst said, voice cautious. But we've isolated 2 additional characters on the plate. It narrows it down. From hundreds to 9. 9 vehicles. 9 owners in 2005. Some had moved. Some had sold the car. 1 vehicle had been scrapped. Another written off in a minor collision months after the murder. The owner of that one caught Hale's attention. Insurance records indicated front-end damage inconsistent with the reported incident. The car had been sold for parts. The owner's name surfaced again in the old file. Not as a suspect. As a peripheral witness. A man who claimed he had driven through the high street that night, but had seen nothing unusual. His statement was brief. Unremarkable. He had never been pressed further. Hale stared at the page. A small detail. A line that read, subject appeared nervous, attributed to presence of police. Nervousness is common. Innocent people sweat under questioning. But memory is selective. And patterns matter. The man was still in the region. Different address. Different job. Older. Married. Hale requested a voluntary interview. When the man entered the interview room, he looked composed. Polite. He shook Hale's hand firmly. His eyes did not linger. You remember why you're here? Hale asked. I heard you're reviewing old cases, the man replied evenly. Thought this was finished. Just tying up loose ends. Loose ends. The phrase hung heavy. They revisited 2005. The man repeated his story almost verbatim from the original statement. Driving home from a late shift. Passing through the high street. Noticing flashing lights ahead. Turning around. Going back the way he came. Your vehicle was later involved in an accident, Hale said casually. Front end damage. Minor bump. Car in front braked suddenly. Insurance photos show more than a minor bump. A pause. Small. Almost imperceptible. It was years ago, the man said. Hard to remember details. Hard to remember or hard to explain. Hale watched his breathing. The tightening jaw. The slight shift in posture. They asked for DNA. Voluntary. Routine in cold case reviews. The man hesitated. Then agreed. Weeks passed. The forensic lab moved slowly, methodically. They compared the new sample to material preserved from 2005. Back then, the technology had been limited. Partial profiles. Inconclusive results. Now, techniques were sharper. More sensitive. Able to extract stories from fragments invisible to the naked eye. Hale waited. He visited the alley again one evening. The bricks were damp. The air carried the metallic scent of rain. He imagined the timeline. 22:12 call. 22:17 movement on CCTV. 22:20 estimated time of death. A narrow window. Brutal in its efficiency. He imagined footsteps echoing. A confrontation. Words exchanged. A sudden escalation. The community had built myths over the years. A stranger passing through town. A secret lover. Organized crime. None of it had stuck. None of it had proven real. But what if it was smaller than that? What if it was ordinary? A fleeting encounter. A spark of anger. A decision made in seconds. The lab called on a Thursday morning. We have a match. Not full. Not absolute. But strong. Fibers found on the victim's coat matched fibers from the interior of the man's old vehicle. The probability of coincidence was slim. Hale felt the room tilt. Fiber evidence is subtle. It does not shout. It whispers. It suggests proximity. Contact. Presence. The man had claimed he never left his car. A warrant was prepared. When officers arrived at his current address, neighbors watched from behind curtains. The arrest was quiet. Controlled. No sirens. Just a firm knock and a statement read in measured tones. Shock rippled through the street. At the station, the man's composure fractured. He denied everything at first. Called it coincidence. Insisted the fibers transferred accidentally. Perhaps the victim had brushed against his car days earlier. Perhaps contamination. But Hale presented the timeline. The enhanced plate. The inconsistent insurance report. The nervousness noted years before. The fibers. The fact that the scrapped vehicle could no longer be re-examined. You were there, Hale said softly. Not just driving through. Silence stretched. The man's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. He rubbed his hands together as if cold. "It wasn't meant to happen," he murmured. The words landed like a detonation. He described an argument. A misunderstanding. He claimed the victim approached his car, accusing him of reckless driving earlier that evening. Voices raised. Tempers flared. He stepped out. A shove. Another shove. A fall. Panic. A desperate attempt to move the body into the alley to avoid being seen. He insisted it was not premeditated. Not planned. Just a moment that spiraled beyond control. But moments do not erase responsibility. The confession was partial, tangled with self-preservation. Yet it was enough. News broke within hours. United Kingdom, 2005 murder mystery solved. Arrest shocks community. 15-year cold case breakthrough. The headlines rolled out like thunder. Families wept. Some in relief. Some in renewed grief. Outside the courthouse months later, cameras flashed as the accused was led inside. Older now. Hair thinning. Face drawn. The weight of years evident. The trial dissected every second of that October night. Experts testified about fibers, about enhanced images, about the evolution of forensic science. The defense argued contamination, unreliable memory, coerced confession. The prosecution built a mosaic of small truths forming a larger, undeniable picture. Jurors listened. They watched the old CCTV footage projected onto modern screens. Grainy figures from 2005 magnified into the present. Time collapsing into a single courtroom. When the verdict came, it was quiet. Guilty. No cheers. No applause. Just a collective exhale. The sentence followed. Years in prison. Not enough to rewind time. Not enough to restore what was taken. But enough to acknowledge it. Outside, the high street moved on as it always had. Cars passed. Shop doors opened and closed. The alley remained narrow and unremarkable. But something had shifted. The word unsolved no longer hovered over the town like a storm cloud. It had been replaced by another word, justice. And yet, even with the case closed, a residue remained. Questions about how close it had been to slipping away forever. About the fragility of truth when technology lags behind cruelty. About how many other boxes sit on metal shelves, waiting for sharper eyes, better tools, a detective unwilling to let go. The murder of 2005 had finally found its ending, but the echo of it lingered in brick and asphalt, in memory and in silence, a reminder that time buries nothing completely, that secrets erode under patience, and that sometimes, years later, the smallest fiber can pull an entire lie apart. The sentencing should have been the end. It should have sealed the wound, stitched the town back together, filed the case into archives marked closed in thick black ink. But justice, even when delivered, has a way of unsettling the ground beneath it. Because after the conviction, questions began to surface, quiet at first, murmured in kitchens and pubs, then louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. The man had confessed. Yes. He had placed himself at the scene. Yes. Fiber evidence had connected him to the victim. Yes. A jury had found him guilty beyond reasonable doubt. But one detail refused to settle. The timeline. Back in 2005, the estimated time of death had been placed between 2218 and 2222. Narrow. Clinical. Based on body temperature, witness accounts, CCTV timestamps. During trial, the prosecution leaned heavily on 2220. But a retired pathologist, watching the case unfold from his cottage in the countryside, felt a prickle of unease. He had worked the original scene. He remembered the cold air that night. The damp brick. The delay before paramedics were called. He retrieved his old notes. The body temperature reading had been taken at 23:05. But the alley had acted like a wind tunnel. Ambient temperature had been unusually low for October. If wind chill had been factored differently, the window could widen. By minutes. 5 minutes. Maybe 8. It sounded insignificant. It wasn't. Because at 22:14, another CCTV camera, one that had not been enhanced until recently, captured a different figure entering the high street from the opposite end. A hooded silhouette. Taller than the convicted man. Moving with purpose. In 2005, the image had been dismissed as a passerby. No clear face. No crime visible. In 2023, new software sharpened the frame. The figure was carrying something long. Slender. Reflective. An umbrella. A walking stick. Or something else. Detective Inspector Hale had closed the file with reluctant satisfaction. Now it was back on his desk, reopened not officially, but in his mind. He stared at the enhanced still image. 22:14. 3 minutes before the convicted man's car appeared on the opposite camera. Could two people have been there? The confession had described an argument escalating near the driver's door. A shove. A fall. No weapon. No third party. But the autopsy report had noted a contusion at the back of the skull inconsistent with a simple fall. It had been debated at trial. The prosecution argued it could have occurred when the victim hit the brick wall. The defense suggested otherwise, that a blunt object might have been involved. The jury chose the simpler narrative. Occam's razor. The obvious suspect. The fibers. The confession. But what if obvious wasn't complete? Hale visited the prison. The convicted man sat behind reinforced glass, hands folded. He looked thinner. Paler. The weight of incarceration evident in the way his shoulders curved inward. You said it wasn't planned, Hale began evenly. It wasn't, the man replied. You said there was no weapon. There wasn't. Hale slid a printed still across the table. The hooded figure. Time stamp glowing in white digits. Who is this? The man squinted. His brow furrowed. I don't know. You're sure? I was alone. Alone. The word hung in the sterile air. Hale watched for microreactions. A flicker. A tell. But the man's confusion seemed genuine. Outside, rain streaked against the prison windows. If there had been a second person, why hadn't the convicted man mentioned it? To deflect blame. To reduce his sentence. To create doubt. Unless he hadn't seen them. Unless events had unfolded too fast. Hale returned to the alley once more. He stood exactly where the body had been found. He mapped distances in his mind. From car door to wall. From wall to CCTV blind spot. If someone had approached from the far end at 22:14, they could have reached the alley by 22:17. Hidden in shadow. Observing. Or intervening. The case file was thick. But even thick files have gaps. He re-examined witness statements from that night. A shopkeeper recalled hearing raised voices, but couldn't distinguish how many. A teenager waiting for a bus had reported 2 shapes moving quickly, but admitted she'd been distracted by her phone. 2 shapes. Not one. Why hadn't that detail been pressed harder? Because panic distorts memory. Because teenagers are unreliable witnesses. Because investigators were chasing a vehicle. Because sometimes a narrative forms early, and everything else bends around it. Hale requested phone data again, not just from the convicted man, but from numbers pinging nearby cell towers between 22:10 and 22:25 that night. In 2005, data retention laws were different. Much had been lost, but fragments remained in archived telecom backups. A cluster of devices had passed through. Normal traffic for a high street. But one number lingered. Stationary. Active. No registered owner, a pay-as-you-go SIM purchased with cash. It had connected to the nearest mast at 22:13. Disconnected at 22:23. 10 minutes. Hale felt a chill. The number had never appeared in the original investigation. Technology in 2005 hadn't made it easy to extract such granular cell data. Now it did. He traced the SIM purchase location, a small convenience store 3 towns over. CCTV from that store had long since been overwritten. No trail. No name. But the pattern troubled him. Was the convicted man guilty? Yes. Did he cause the death? The jury believed so. But was he alone? The question pressed against Hale's conscience. If a second person had been present, if a blow from an object had contributed, if the initial shove had not been fatal, then the narrative shifted. Complicity. Escalation. Shared guilt. Or even manipulation. He replayed the confession recording. The moment where the man said, "It wasn't meant to happen." His voice cracked, but there had been something else, a pause before the words. As if selecting the safest version of truth. Prison changes men. So does time. Hale requested a follow-up interview. This time, the man's eyes were tired. Less guarded. Was anyone else there? Hale asked directly. No. You didn't see anyone approach? No. Did anyone approach you afterward? Silence. The man swallowed. There was someone at the end of the street, he said slowly. I thought they were just walking past. What did they look like? Dark clothing. Hood up. I didn't pay attention. Why didn't you mention this before? I didn't think it mattered. It mattered. Did they come closer? I don't know. I was panicking. Panic erases peripheral vision. Panic narrows the world to survival. But if someone had stepped into the alley after the shove, if someone had struck the victim, if someone had whispered something to the convicted man in the chaos, that detail had never surfaced. And yet no additional DNA had been found at the scene. No foreign fibers beyond those explained at trial. No second set of footprints clearly distinguished from the muddy impressions already attributed to the convicted man. Hale felt trapped between certainty and doubt. The community, meanwhile, had embraced closure. Memorial plaques were updated. News articles revised from unsolved to solved after 15 years. The narrative felt clean. Satisfying. Reopening ambiguity would fracture that peace. But justice is not about comfort. It is about truth. Late one night, alone in his office, Hale projected the CCTV footage onto the wall again. 22:14, the hooded figure enters frame. The reflective object catches light for a fraction of a second. He slowed the footage to a crawl. Frame by frame. The object glinted. Not curved like an umbrella. Straight. Metallic. A bar. A tool? Or simply an artifact of digital noise? He zoomed further. Pixels fractured. The image dissolved into static blocks. Technology could sharpen, but not resurrect. He leaned back, exhausted. If there had been a second actor, they had vanished perfectly. No name. No trace. No confession. Just 10 minutes of cell signal and a shadow on grainy tape. The convicted man remained behind bars. But the alley in Hale's mind was no longer populated by two figures. It held three. One victim. One convicted killer. And one silhouette standing just beyond the reach of resolution. The case was closed in the eyes of the court. Files stamped. Sentence passed. Yet in the quiet hours, when the station lights dimmed and the hum of fluorescent bulbs filled the corridors, the question echoed louder than ever. Was the United Kingdom 2005 murder mystery truly solved? Or had the town accepted the first solid answer, because it needed one? Outside, the high street glittered under fresh rain, reflecting neon signs and passing headlights. Life moved forward. Conversations shifted. New crimes took headlines. But somewhere in archived telecom data, and corrupted pixels, in a hooded shape frozen at 2214, a fragment of that night still resisted clarity. And for Detective Inspector Hale, the story no longer ended with a verdict. It ended with a shadow that refused to step fully into the light.